All right, and I'm going to open it up for the audience right now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our April webinar. Thank you all for attending despite the currently rather chaotic times that are going on out there. Just want to welcome you all to our Equity and Mental Health on Post-Secondary Campuses webinar. Just some really quick housekeeping if you've never attended one of our webinars before. You can find the webinars, a copy of the webinar slides in PDF form underneath the files tabs that you can download and if you want to follow along with the webinar, as well as a quick Adobe Connect guide if you're having some trouble figuring out what buttons and what to do in this webinar. For the duration of the webinar, participants are on mute. However, we would love and would encourage you to use the chat box at the bottom in case you want to just shout out like, hi, I'm from Windsor. Hi, I'm from BC. We'd love to hear from you as well. With that, I would like to introduce our amazing speaker for today, Sana Imran, who is from the Canadian Mental Health Association. And Sana, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Hi, everyone. Perfect. Thank you so much, Perlin. Hi, everyone. This is really exciting. I'm glad to see we have some participants online. We were just talking about how we weren't sure what's going to happen given everyone's workflow right now with COVID. So it's really nice to have everyone here. Just a note, I know that typically you'd probably be able to see my face, but Perlin and I had a little chat before this and decided that just given the amount of pressure on Adobe nowadays with everybody working from home and in general systems being overloaded, that the quality of the sound is actually better if I'm not showing my face. So I apologize. Hopefully, if we do one in the future, we can change that. But yeah, please do feel free to type in the chat box, and I would still love to interact with you in those ways. So today's webinar is on the topic of equity and mental health. So a big thank you to the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health and to Perlin for organizing this and for everyone taking the time to come here and be together to talk about this topic. It's certainly coming up in a lot of different contexts, so it would be interesting to see what's happening on campuses and your view on what should be happening right now. As Perlin said, my name is Sana. So I am a policy analyst with the Canadian Mental Health Association of Ontario. I'm the lead on health equity, part of the policy team, and I'm a social worker by background. So a lot more experience in clinical frontline mental health and now sort of moving into the system level policy work. So I'll tell you a little bit. Yeah, perfect. I hope you can all see the slides as well. So Canadian Mental Health, we are a nonprofit, a provincial organization as the Ontario division, and we've got service branches across Ontario. So we have almost 30 CMHAs serving clients in areas like housing, counseling, therapy, primary care with a lot of nursing programs, overdose prevention programs, employment supports, and the list kind of goes on and on. It's pretty diverse. And so we support all of these branches and the wider community of mental health and addiction sector, and then also work with government to sort of build some cohesion and understanding on what's needed on the front lines and how to get it there. And so for today, CICMH, which is the Campus Mental Health Center for Innovation Campus Mental Health, they work very closely with CMHA Ontario in a lot of different projects, and then decided to collaborate on this particular guide for post-secondary campuses in the area of equity. There is a toolkit posted online. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to see that. That has a lot more information, and I'll show you like kind of a screenshot of it at the very end. So that's where I would suggest going for more in-depth information and examples and like step-by-step guides on how to do some of this work. Because we really only have probably less than an hour today, let's face it, in terms of how much I'm going to be able to talk. And so it's really a very broad overview and very general. So I would encourage you to definitely look at that toolkit after we're done as well. The toolkit itself was reviewed by several different organizations. So some that come to mind are through the Council of Ontario Universities, the Aboriginal Reference Group, and then through Colleges Ontario as well, the Indigenous Peoples Education Circle. So it's been through a few different eyes. And if you have comments or feedback on it, we'd love to hear that as well. So over here, I'm showing just a brief agenda of what we will cover today. So this is, we're going to talk really high level, the definitions of equity, mental health, and the social determinants of health. Then we want to talk about how these different pieces intersect and what we can use from those intersections to understand student experiences on campus. So how can we use this information to understand what we can do in each of our roles to support students in their experience of mental health on campus, all of which is very, very defined by the level of equity that they're experiencing. So I know that we have several different kinds of professionals on the webinar today. Some of you might be frontline workers, some might be program managers, some might be from student life. So I'm hoping that we can provide ideas that can help at different levels. But if you have specific questions or thoughts that we haven't covered, definitely type them in the chat box. And if I'm not able to support you on the webinar, I'm happy for you to email me or Perlin after this, and we can brainstorm other ideas to help you as well. So before we dive into the content, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. So the land on which I am currently on is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. More than 40 treaties and other land agreements cover Ontario, and today we are still home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island and are so grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. These acknowledgements I find are often imperfect, and they also sort of play the role of provoking us to consider the ongoing impact our work has on Indigenous people and sort of reflect on whether we will maintain the status quo or we will serve to improve the shared decision making, renew our relationships across communities, and improve access, experience, and outcomes for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Ontario. I also recognize that many of you attending virtually today are on different parcels of land that do not apply to this land acknowledgement. And so if you would like any materials on land acknowledgements for Ontario more broadly, also let me know and I can share some reference documents that can help you better understand how to create one and what goes into that for yourself. So moving forward. Okay, so as I said, we'd start with some broad definitions. So this is the definition for equity, and I find it really hard to talk about equity in a definition form because if you were to sort of try and research it, there's many different ways to understand the word equity and variations of one definition. So what I think of equity is an understanding of what several groups in society have not had in comparison to others. So it says here, equity is a way to address marginalization. In contrast to equality, which seeks the same treatment for all individuals, an equity-based approach recognizes that different actions are required to achieve similar outcomes for different individuals or groups due to the uneven distribution of power, wealth, and other resources in society. So I'd encourage you to break this down because it's a bit wordy and first think of the experiences of those individuals or groups who have not had access to power, wealth, and resources. And consider what they may require in order to even be compared to others in society. Equity means looking more closely at these individuals' needs and considering what may be done to enhance their ability to play a different role in the larger society. So over here, you'll see a picture, and I'm wondering if we can use the chat box here to see if anyone can sort of comment on what they notice is the difference between the left and the right side of this picture. So I'll just give a couple of seconds here to see if anyone wants to comment on that. No pressure, but would be great to hear from somebody. Okay, we'll move forward. So
Oh wait, it looks like there's a couple of people who just shared their thoughts.
Oh, for some reason I can't see them, Perlin. Am I
Oh,
supposed to be able to see this?
strange. Wait, yes, the chat. Can you see the chat? It's where it
No,
says
actually I can
chat.
see a presenter chat.
Oh, that's weird. Because that is a chat that says chat everyone. No?
No. Well, I mean,
Oh,
I can see that, but I can't see anyone's comments. But I'll let you sort of
you know
share
what?
them then.
I'll just read it out then.
Thank
um
you.
yeah, so we have Victoria who says doesn't remove the structure that's causing the need for help. Margaret saying different supports for different people. And Janet says, what is fair isn't equal. And Leanne, hi everyone. The left depicts the same form of support for all, whereas the right depicts specific support per individual. And Nicole says it's equity versus fair.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Perlin. That's helpful. Yeah, I think everyone's sort of hitting on different parts of the exact same topic, which is exactly why equity itself is can be a difficult topic to quantify. But um, the the left side you'll notice is kind of the depiction of equality, where everyone is getting the same opportunity to try and achieve something. So in this case, it's the same box to stand on when watching a baseball game. So in using this approach, all three individuals are actually in the same position as before. So the most advantaged is continuing to be the most advantaged, while the least advantaged continues to be the least advantaged. And on the right-hand side of the picture, they've tried to depict equity, where each individual is receiving a different box height depending on what they need in order to succeed. So as a result, each person has ended up being a similar height and is equally able to watch the game. So when we're talking about equity, we're talking about understanding what someone may need more or less of in order to change their experience of something going forward. So thank you everyone for those comments. That's helpful. Um, so the next one I wanted to just briefly talk about is mental health, and I'm sure most of you here have a good understanding of this, but just to sort of reiterate that as CMHT Ontario, we think of mental health as on a continuum. So um, we think of it as the experience of emotional and spiritual well-being that we're able to obtain when our culture, our race, and our personal dignity are respected. So, mental health is the capacity of all of us to think, feel, and act in a way that enables us to enjoy life, participate in it, and weather the challenges that we are faced with. So, over here, you'll see the continuum that I was talking about. So, we believe that you can have positive mental health and have a diagnosis of some sort, and you could also have poor mental health without a diagnosis. So, um, the we don't believe it in that very clinical sense. We think of it into the larger experience of everyday living, which brings me to the social determinants of health. So we believe that all of our experiences are grounded in the social determinants of health, which are the living conditions that shape our lives. So some of the examples listed here include our experiences in early life, such as adverse childhood events, the gender we identify with, our employment conditions, our social safety net, cultural, racial identity, so our experience of the social determinants of health determine our experience of positive mental health. So I didn't list all the determinants of health here, but if you would like a resource for this, I recommend the Canadian Facts by Juha Mikkonen and Dennis Raphael. And they have a website as well called thecanadianfacts.org. Again, if you have questions, just email me and I can send you more information about that. But on the next slide here, you'll see sort of a depiction of how the social determinants of health can play a role in our everyday life. So again, you'll see two images, the top and bottom, and in both of them, the finish line is called health. So on the top half, you'll see the individual kind of running towards the finish line, and they're able to do this with the support of financial resources and education and the comfort of a job. So health is very achievable when you have these resources behind you. And then the bottom half, you'll see the roadblocks that someone has to go through on their way to try to achieve health. So those roadblocks are listed as social, economic, political, and these are the experiences of marginalization we reference when talking about equity. So that person has many challenges to overcome on their path toward health. Next slide. Right. So we probably all know the impact that social determinants of health have on our everyday life and the role that they play in mental health. And then there was further research done into exactly which social determinants of health um, impact the greatest on mental health. So these were the three that researchers have found that are the biggest factors in our mental health. So freedom from discrimination and violence, having access to economic resources, and being socially included. Discrimination here, we're referring to the actions taken to exclude or treat others differently because of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and violence is the vehicle through which the discrimination is acted out. So it could be abuse, neglect, it could be bullying, intimate partner violence, and etc. Um, Access to economic resources, it's pretty self-explanatory. So it's the ability to be able to purchase what we need in order to live comfortably. And social inclusion is that feeling of connectedness that can help enhance our sense of self-esteem, our purpose, and is protective of mental health. So we often say that social ties are like a buffer to stressors. And so I think a lot of people are probably thinking about that now when it comes to COVID, for example. So the absence of one or all three of these impacts our ability to experience positive mental health. So I'm going to ask another question here um, and see if anybody has any thoughts on some examples of population groups that have been affected by some or all of these determinants. I'll give you a couple minutes to see if anyone has any thoughts on individuals here. And again, I can't see the chat box for some reason. So Perlin, I will leave it to you to let me know if anybody does type anything.
Yes, no worries. Just a couple of stuff rolling in now. New immigrants,
Yes.
the 2S LGBTQ plus community,
Hmm.
indigenous communities,
Yes.
women with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're all on the right track. So, um, for example, when it comes to Indigenous students, we know that they've experienced decades of systemic discrimination, certainly lots of violence, social exclusion, of course, economic marginalization. So they've sort of are one group that we know has been impacted by all three of these determinants. And so their ability to even access education, let alone higher education, is that much harder, which impacts obviously their path toward health, as we saw earlier. So yes, and all those other groups that you've mentioned, women with disabilities, the LGBTQ plus population, even international students, like I think that we could almost see most students on our campuses are affected by even one or all of these determinants. So when you're experiencing these, it not only impacts your ability to come be a participant on campus, but how their experiences, how they interact with other students, how they interact with staff, how they feel in classroom settings, in very traditional lecture style settings. So there's lots of different areas that we can talk about. And so we'll now sort of switch to the different strategies that need to be considered when we're talking about students' mental health in the context of equity. So when we think about life on campus, there are so many different ways a student's mental health can be impacted. I'm sure you know this better than anyone. And so this is like their personal relationships, their families, um, their interactions with faculty, health and wellness staff, student life. So all of these impact how we behave in our roles and then what we decide to do when we interact with students. So I would say that every single aspect that we go through every day has an impact on our students. So how we think about our own identity, how we look at other people's identities, how we perceive their actions, the programs that we're running or working in, or the ideas we have for new programs, and our ability to advocate for any kind of change. I mean, this is just like a tiny list in the realm of everyday things that we do that ultimately leave an impact on those students' mental health. So the first step that I think it starts with and is the use of self. So I like the term use of self simply because of my background as a social worker. We would often refer to our use of self in sessions as a way to understand our position in the room and the impact that that's having on our clients. And that encourages us to think about our verbal and our nonverbal actions and what we could do to enhance the client's sense of comfort and safety. And so essentially for what I mean when I say use of self is self-reflection that we need to do. So our identity, as I mentioned earlier, is the lens through which we view the world. It grounds us, it guides us and defines who we are and what we do. And reflecting on that is an extremely important step before we try and embark on creating change for somebody else. So we need to learn about our place in the world and the privilege that we hold and the impact that that can have on somebody else. We often think of self reflection as the foundation for cultural humility, which is essentially the making space for other people to share their voice and listening to them without judgment and being open to learning from them. And these actions wouldn't be possible without an understanding of our own position in the world and the biases and assumptions that come with that. And so, beyond cultural humility, we're actually working, the whole goal of all of this is to cultivate cultural safety. And cultural safety is something that can only be defined by the person you're interacting with because it's their experience of safety in receiving the service from you. So there is a video at this link, which we are not going to show simply because of the quality of these videos on webinars, and it is also like 5 minutes long, so it might be a little bit tiring for you to watch on a webinar, but the slides will be available to you, and that link is in the slide, so I encourage you to take a look at it because it really it beautifully illustrates the concept of cultural safety and the many components that are a part of it. So I find it helpful in breaking it down to make it easy to understand. But I wanted to also show these. So this is a tool. Again, this is really hard to talk about or like work through on an online platform like a webinar like this, but these are some tools, this one and the one on the next slide, that a lot of people use to um, sort of understand their own position in the world and how that fits in the larger context. And I want to ask a poll question here because I'm curious to see how many people have actually participated in an exercise like this. So I'm going to ask Perlin to just pull up the first poll question here so you can just click on whichever one applies to you. So the question is, have you participated in an exercise such as this? So I showed two over here, but there's other ones out there. I know there's one that's commonly done at U of T. I remember in the Faculty of Social Work called the Power Flowers. So there's definitely a lot of variations of it. So just curious to see how many of you have actually done one of these before.
Just want to quickly check, is the poll showing up on screen? So I just opened it up, but I'm not sure if it's actually showing up for people.
So I can see it on my end.
Oh, you can see. Oh, that's so technical issues. Let me see. I sometimes feel like Adobe Connect is just like this black box, and I have no idea what's going on half the time. Okay, well, people are answering in the chat anyway.
Awesome. Okay.
Um, so yes, I've seen both tools. I'm guessing. And actually, I can't tell if this is a no, I don't see the poll, or no, I don't, or no, I've never seen the tool.
Okay. Okay. That's fair. So um, if anyone has any comment, I'm also the other poll question that I wanted to ask, but it looks like the polls aren't working so well, is if it has actually helped in any way, like either helped you understand your own position better or changed how you view somebody else. If anyone wants to comment on that, I'd be curious to see your response there. Because personally, I found it really helpful years ago when I first started doing them. And I'll sometimes kind of go back and look at it again and kind of redo mine because it's just helpful for me to reflect that way. But maybe other people have had different experiences using these.
Yeah, so we have some answers. Victoria says, I've used the tools in a large group of faculty learners, and the response was not very acceptive.
The response was not very accepted. Okay, I'm curious what that means, but you won't
And
have that.
Victoria, do you want to elaborate?
We can move forward if you would like to share. I would still love to hear from you if you want to type in there. But yeah, so
Yep, just have some. Is there a mic option? Let me explore that actually. I might be able to enable the mic. Oh, I've enabled your mic, Victoria. You want to say something? Hmm, don't hear. I have enabled your mic, but I don't think we're hearing anything.
okay. Um,
That's
okay.
okay.
Thank you
No
for
worries.
trying
So
that,
just
Perlin.
just a chat function.
Yeah, so Victoria, if you still want to type, please feel free to. Anyone else, if they want to as well, we'll certainly get to your comments. But just in the interest of time, I'll keep moving forward. I do encourage everyone to kind of take a look at them. Like they're a little bit adapted. So, for example, the one that I have up on the screen right now is actually from the Canadian Council of Refugees. So that's why you'll see one of the tabs over there says new to the CCR versus CCR old timers. So that's kind of for employees internally to do as well. So definitely try to consider doing these because our use of self and the way we process our own self-reflection will impact how we use the power that's granted to us and our voice in each of our positions. So some questions are listed here that you could ask yourself as you continue in the process of discovering your own position. So there are obviously like different depending on the workplace and the roles that you're playing on campus, but with that, I would encourage you to think about things like your position on your team, whether you feel heard, represented, and valued, and then sort of who else is on your team, whether they are given that same or similar space that you have earned, perhaps, or been given, fortunate enough, depending on who you're working with. And then think about your external meetings and how they are formed, how membership is formed, how is decision making done, and what role do you play in these areas? These are all things that we sort of have the power to think about in our own capacity, and by doing this work it can be very hard, it can be very uncomfortable, but doing that enables us to understand what's happening for the other person sitting across from us, and so in this case what's happening for those students eventually is what we want to get at. So, moving on then. So, the first step, as I said, would be our self-reflection, which then moves into our one-on-one interactions with these. So these are those individual level interactions we're having with students. And what we've done here is kind of broken them down depending on the determinants of health that I mentioned earlier. So you'll see the three questions. How can we support students in feeling safe from experiences of discrimination and violence? Then how can we support students in feeling socially included? And lastly, how can we support students in accessing economic resources? Um, so I've listed a couple of examples here. I won't go through every single one of them simply because we want to cover a lot more content, but um, some of these examples and more are in the toolkit that I referenced earlier. So I'd encourage you to look back at that if you're curious about some of the points that I've listed here. But so just looking at the first question for now about supporting students in feeling safe, I've written language as one of the examples. So I, I believe it's a huge component because the words that we use to express ourselves and relate to others play a huge role in how the other person is hearing, perceiving, and forming their experience of it. So being mindful of the words that we choose to use can really impact the student's experience in front of us. So on the next slide here, I provided just an example, and this is actually a resource that we developed at CICMH Ontario a couple of years ago. And this one is specifically around mindful language when it comes to substance use. So there's a little chart there, and you'll see on the left side of it, it says instead of, and on the right side, it says try. So the first example says instead of saying drug user, you would try saying a person who uses drugs. And so it goes on, instead of saying drug abuser or addict, you would say a person who uses drugs problematically or a person with a substance use disorder. So really what you're getting at is person first language. And you can look at that in more detail. I've linked again the source for that if you'd like. And there's tons more resources out, I know, on mindful language with different communities, with different cultures as well. And of course, you may not always know the right word to use. There'll be situations where you're not sure how to refer to someone. And so um, I would encourage that in those situations, I found the best approach really is to be very honest and be very gentle and curious and share that you're asking how they would prefer to be identified. I think it's better to go about it in that space of honesty than to assume something and then find yourself in a tough position after. So going back to this slide then, I also wanted to quickly chat about social inclusion for students. So we know that the degree to which a student feels comfortable on campus will depend on the congruence between their cultural background and the dominant culture of the educational institution. So we know how important it is for people to feel connected, part of a community, and part of the larger institution. We also know how challenging that can be for students that don't see parts of their identity represented and that have trouble finding the platforms on which to connect with one another. So I think some campuses are doing an absolutely amazing job of trying to create spaces and platforms for students to connect, which is phenomenal. I know there's lots of international student centers and then different groups on campuses that try to help students find that representation that they're sort of seeking and craving. And then I think that we still have that role to take on of asking questions, acknowledging the diversity, and sort of naming the inequities that has affected their experience so far. Um, we want to increase their comfort, and part of that comfort means talking about what they have been through and the hardships that they have experienced, and then identify that we want to help them with that, and we want to be their voice or help them raise their voice when we can. So, in line of that, if you move forward, um, again, I won't go into detail, but I have shown here a toolkit that I found really interesting and very well done called the Indigenous Ally Toolkit, and the link for that is at the bottom as well. So it really talks about the meaning of allyship and concrete steps and examples that we can take in order to start that process of how we can become an ally ourselves. Um, and again, I will always preface that this work is really hard to do and can come across as very disingenuous if you're not doing that work on yourself and learning about your own process first, and then considering what role you're going to play in helping individuals raise their voices. Okay, so those were some examples of like one-on-one levels of interaction. So moving up are the program level interactions. So our individual interactions are going to be influenced by the larger forces at play. So if a program itself has a structure that perpetuates experiences of discrimination or violence, prevents social inclusion, and blocks access to economic resources, our individual efforts towards more equitable interactions with our students will be very limited in their impact. So again, you'll see here the three questions about promoting feelings of safety, supporting social inclusion, and promoting access to economic resources. So let's sort of skip ahead to the last question here since we did the first two earlier. So this question is asking about how we support students in achieving a lifestyle that allows them to pursue their educational goals. And this is very possible through programs that support students in accessing like safe and affordable housing or applying to different sources of funding and grants and accessing employment opportunities. We know that we spoke about Indigenous students having to experience quite a bit of the social determinants of health earlier, and then they also incur really heavy expenses when they're relocating for post-secondary education. A lot of these students have already faced significant barriers to access economic resources in their home communities, and so this next step can be that much harder. We also can think of international students who are leaving behind their entire support networks in their home countries and arriving in a new place without um, any platforms on which they can already connect on, and then facing really high fees because of their international status. So one thing that I always think about is how opportunities to earn different sources of funding or access grants and scholarships are being advertised. And this is just like one aspect of it, but when we're considering how they're promoted, it's we have to think about the tools that are being used, what kinds of materials are going into it, um, what platforms are being taken into consideration, what languages are documents being translated into. When we're recruiting students into these kinds of opportunities, it's important to consider are a higher percentage coming from specific programs, and why is that? Why are some students accessing these and others are not? Um, and how can we increase some of that access? So you can see that just the promotion of it can take up so much space in figuring out how to make it equitable that there's a lot more thought that has to go into these than I think sometimes people will notice. So what I've shown on the next slide here is actually a health equity impact assessment. I don't know if people over here have used this before, heard of it, or have any feelings about it. I know there's different opinions out there, but it can be a very useful tool to analyze the different aspects of a program or a policy as well and see where there might be hidden impacts that are harder to see until you look at it in this way. And so it even sort of walks you through how to mitigate some of these impacts on the population that you're trying to help. If you have any questions about the impact assessment, again, I'm happy to send resources out about that. There's a whole workbook online, and you can even see the assessment having been completed for certain programs out there to help you understand how you can go about doing it for your program or a policy that you might be working on. That's one area that I would encourage you to think about. And then last but not least are the policy level interactions. So creating campuses that are equitable and inclusive requires a very close look at the underlying policies. Um, the policy provides a framework for program design and then determines how services are being delivered, which impacts how you're going to interact with those students. So without equitable policies in place, every single step below that are very limited. So one area, for example, could be what's happening within classrooms. So I remember when I was a student in my undergraduate program, primarily, we would have guest speakers come in one of our classrooms, and I noticed that I very rarely saw my identity being represented in a guest speaker coming in. So that's something that you would find a policy could be in place to help guide how faculty are going about bringing in guest speakers for their classes. So are they reflective of the student body, not just on the campus, but within the classroom as well? Another example would be within classrooms are the spaces that students are being taught in. As we said before, it's really important for students to feel their identity is being represented as on the campus that they're part of. So what are the names of the buildings on campus? How do those names get decided? What do they represent about the larger campus life? I know some campuses have taken amazing steps to rename buildings in Aboriginal languages. Some have created spaces for elders in residences. So those are some things to think about. Another aspect would be I've written here curriculum enhancements, and what I'm trying to say over there is really um, what about the core curriculum requirements and what does that really mean? I remember when I was in my undergraduate, the only requirement I had outside of the regular English math kind of thing was French, and so I'm wondering what changes could be made to include so that different histories of cultures are becoming mandatory components, so that everyone is walking in and out with like a baseline knowledge of different cultures. Maybe it's about Indigenous history, because a lot of students don't get to learn that until they look into it themselves. So these are all things that would fall under the topic of policy changes and really high levels, so that if they're in place at that stage, then every single faculty member, every single program manager, everybody on campus has to abide by certain frameworks and work within them. So, for example, I put on this slide a picture here, which would technically, a slide like that, like a picture like that, sorry, would fall under a policy requirement. And so I'm wondering, I'm assuming a lot of people are familiar with these signs by now, the all gender restrooms. Most campuses, I would hope, have moved towards putting up all gender washrooms and encouraging that. But I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on, like, if you look at this sign here, if something is missing or it needs to be different, or if it provokes any thought for anyone. So I'll just give a second here to see if anyone wants to type anything. Let me know.
Yeah, we just have a couple of people typing. Oh, we have someone saying, is that a cape or a dress?
Was that? I think it's supposed to be a dress.
Yep, a few more people typing. While that's happening, Sana, I'm gonna mess around with the controls a little bit to see if I can find a way to let you see the chat.
Yeah, that would be really helpul. I'm sorry, I didn't. I just assumed it would show up because I see a chat box there,
It's
but
so strange. It's so strange. Are you seeing anything now?
no.
Nope. Okay, never mind. Moving on. Yeah, we have a couple of other replies. Nicole says, I still think we are showing only two. Why can't it just be a toilet? And Margaret says, it presumes there's only binary choice.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. I think this one, I think when I first started the move towards all gender, this was sort of the acceptable sign. And very quickly, there's been a little bit of criticism around it, but I don't see it changing in a lot of spaces yet. I hope that you can encourage the change in your campus if it hasn't already. But really, we're showing binary genders here. We're showing technically a female and a male, and then a person with a disability. And so apparently, we're showing that these are the three genders that are able to use this washroom. And I agree. Why shouldn't it just be a picture of a toilet um or just even just the words? Like I think there's definitely different ways to show all gender washrooms, and this is a very limited way of expressing that. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate where your thoughts are at. So um yeah, so that's sort of the high levels of what I wanted to talk about today. As I promised, I've put up a screenshot here of the actual toolkit, which has a lot more information and is probably a lot more interesting to read through than hearing my voice for an hour. So thank you for engaging with us and for listening here. So this toolkit is up on the website for the Center for Innovation on Campus Mental Health. And I put up my email address over here as well. As I said, please feel free to email me if there's things you'd like to talk about or have thoughts about future projects and ideas that we could be engaging in as well. We'd love to hear from you. And the last slide is really just my references. So that's not super interesting for you, but I'll leave the email up if it's helpful. And I'm wondering if we can take a few minutes then to see if there were any questions that I could address and support with. Oh, I see the chat box now.
Yes, success.
Thank you.
No
That's
worries.
so helpful. Okay.
So now you can
So
scroll back
we have
if
a
you
few
want.
minutes. Yes. Awesome. Thank you. So we have a few minutes. If people have questions that I can help with, and if I don't have answers, I am really happy to get your email or have you email me and respond that way if there's things that I can't answer right away.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. That was a really that was a really eloquent and great explanation on equity and mental health. So, while we're just waiting for people to have their questions, and again, everyone, please, 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 please ask any questions, share your thoughts in the chat box. I thought it was really interesting talking about the intersectionality piece of mental health and equity, just in the ways that right now we're seeing some of that play out with the current pandemic. In that, so some of the campuses that we support are having to think about when housing on campus is being shut down, where are some of the students going to go? And it's easy to be able to tell students, oh, just go back home to your parents or your family, but it's hard when you're trying to think of it through an equity lens of that some students don't actually live close by with their families, and going home before the term ends means suddenly having to scrape up from God knows where a ton of money to buy a flight back home, or perhaps they don't even live in safe environments, so going home because of the pandemic isn't actually something that's easy to do. So I think we're seeing some of these other aspects of life that are connected to mental health slowly playing out in what is right now a very stressful environment.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I really I appreciate that. I think it's really interesting because when the pandemic started and news about how many people were being diagnosed, and then the news came out about the prime minister's wife having it, and so everybody started commenting on how it knows no boundaries, it's not discriminatory, it can impact anyone and everyone, and yet I think a lot of people miss the point that it's not. It actually doesn't impact everybody the same way. Just because everyone can contract it doesn't mean everyone has the same luxury to keep safe from it. So we have our frontline workers, for example, still at risk. We have our grocery store workers. We have different communities. We've been reading a lot about how more vulnerable populations are continuing to be the most vulnerable because of the risk that they have. Our homeless populations. I know for students as well, you make a great point about safe environments. I still have a clinical practice privately, and many of my clients are not able to speak from home or seek help because it's not a safe space for them. And so, how do you help them? And Victoria here has typed in about incarcerated people. It's become a huge issue recently where um, they're being released out into homelessness, which has always been a problem, but now more so than ever because they can't even connect with their caseworker if they need to because they don't have a phone. Some of them are being released without naloxone. So the issues are really, really wide ranging. And I think there's more learning happening during COVID, which I'm grateful for and also frustrated that it took this for people to sort of acknowledge the importance of thinking about equity in these circumstances. But the conversation's starting, so that's good. And everybody who's connected here today clearly feels the conversation is important. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely, Sana. And I think what we're seeing right now is that in a very forceful way, we're seeing the cracks in society that have been there for a long time, but the pandemic is forcing us to really confront these issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and just to loop back to kind of much, much, much earlier, where I think you were asking to clarify what was meant by people weren't acceptive of the tool. I think I had a response in the chat somewhere.
Oh,
Uh,
yes, I see it. I used the tools in a large group of faculty learners, and the response was not very acceptive.
yes,
Um,
and she did elaborate a little bit later on. I'm trying to see where that was. Mhm.
the response was usually around not seeing how being white is a privilege. Yes. Um, yeah, that's something that I've definitely heard, and I think it's a really tough it's a tough one to deliver depending on the audience that you're with. And I find you have to do a lot of foundational work and priming in order to get to the stage where somebody can see what the tool is even trying to do. So I don't know if any of you are in positions where you are doing this work or training people on the topic of equity on a regular basis, but I've learned that the more foundation I lay and sort of explain what we're trying to get at before I even present a tool like that, the better the response usually is versus just showing the tool and trying to work through it then. Because often that disconnect is still there. But I'm happy to, Victoria, if you'd like to connect, I'm happy to brainstorm other ideas and strategies if it would be helpful for you as well.
Yeah, and so on that point as well, I think something that I heard before of another speaker talking about equity, and that this work is often really challenging to do because it involves, on some level, for most people, a lot of discomfort and kind of in
Hmm.
understanding equity and talking about it in a meaningful way necessitates a feeling of needing to be comfortable with with that discomfort. And that's why it can
Yeah,
be quite hard.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, and so
So
looks like there aren't too many questions, but again, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us in this discussion and this webinar. And Sana, do you have any last thoughts?
just, I just really want to thank everyone. I know this is a very stressful time, and um, it can be hard to take the time to log into things like this, but I hope that it was helpful, and I hope that it was also like a chance to step away from everything that's happening. But please, as I said, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk anytime, and would love to hear what you're doing on your campus and how we can support in having this conversation on a wider level.
Amazing. Thank you, Sana. And just so everyone knows, a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides is going to go out via email tomorrow, as well as I'm going to follow up with Sana to get some of the links to some of the resources that she mentioned, and I'll put that in the email as well. Okay. And please join us for our next webinar as well if you have some time. I think it's April 20th. We're going to have a webinar on mindfulness and meditation, which is something that perhaps a lot of people might be looking to explore given these stressful times. And there'll be a link for that going out in the email as well. All right, folks, thank you very much and wishing you all a very lovely long weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.